The photograph hit the floor of Dexter Trask's kitchen with a sound like a gunshot. Rose Graves stood in the doorway of the ranch house, her dark hair windblown from 3 days of hard riding, her boots caked with red Texas dust, and her gray eyes fixed on the wall above the stone fireplace where a name had been carved into the wood. Not just any name. The same name she had been hunting across 4 states, across 2 years of grief and rage and sleepless nights in roadside boarding houses. The same name that had been written in her dead brother's final letter, pressed into her shaking hand at the funeral by a lawyer who would not meet her eyes. Thomas Graves had told her to find a man named Caleb Trask. She had found instead a photograph of Caleb Trask standing beside a younger man, both of them grinning in the sun, a cattle brand burned into a fence post between them. And beneath the photograph, burned into the wall in careful, deliberate letters, was the inscription, "In memory of Caleb Trask, brother, rancher, honest man. Gone 1881. The man she had come here to confront had been dead for 2 years. And standing at the other end of that kitchen, gripping the edge of the wooden table with both sundark hands, was someone she had never expected to find. Not a villain. Not a man with secrets buried under floorboards and blood on his ledger. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a faded blue shirt rolled to the elbows, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of brown river water catching the afternoon light. Those eyes were watching her with an expression she could not yet name. It was not guilt. It was something worse than guilt. It was grief that recognized grief. "You came looking for my brother," Dexter Trask said, and his voice was low and steady, and absolutely exhausted in the way that only years of carrying something heavy can make a man's voice sound. "Whoever sent you out here looking for Caleb should have had the decency to tell you the truth before they put you on a horse." Rose could not speak. The photograph was on the floor between them, and she could not pick it up and she could not look away from the man's face, because suddenly everything she had prepared herself to say, every accusation and every demand and every righteous fury she had stockpiled through 2 years of searching, had no target anymore. It had nowhere to land. It was just weight, pressing down on her sternum, making it hard to breathe in that warm, dusty kitchen that smelled of coffee and leather and wood smoke. "My name is Rose Graves," she finally managed. "Thomas Graves was my brother." Something moved through Dexter Trask's face. Something cracked and then closed again fast, the way a man clamps a hand over a wound before he lets himself look at how bad it is. "I know who Thomas Graves was," he said quietly. "Sit down, Miss Graves, please. You look like you haven't eaten since Oklahoma." She had not eaten since Oklahoma. That was where it had started, or rather, that was where the trail had finally given her something to follow. 2 years before that kitchen moment, Rose Graves had been living a perfectly ordinary life for a woman in 1882, which meant it was a small life, a careful life, a life shaped mostly by what women were and were not permitted to do in a world that had very strong opinions on the subject. She had been a schoolteacher in the town of Millhaven, Missouri, a town so unremarkable that the most exciting thing that ever happened there was when the grain elevator caught fire in the summer of 1879, and half the men in town stood around watching it burn as if it were entertainment. She had lived with her brother Thomas in a 2-room house on the east side of town, and Thomas had been the kind of man who filled a room without trying to, who laughed easily and worked hard, and had a habit of bringing home stray dogs that Rose then had to feed. Thomas had gone to Texas in the spring of 1880 to look at a land deal. That was what he had called it in his letter. A land deal, a good opportunity, a chance to make something real out west where the soil was different and the cattle were money. Rose had read that letter standing at the schoolhouse window watching her students play in the yard, and she had felt the first small flutter of unease that she would later understand had been instinct. Thomas was dead by October. The official report said it was an accident, a horse, a cliff edge, a bad night. The lawyer in Millhaven had read the report to Rose in a low voice, while she sat in a straight-backed chair across his desk and kept her hands very still in her lap, because If she moved her hands, she might break something, and she was not yet ready to break things. She was still in the part of grief where you hold perfectly still and wait to understand if it is real. The lawyer had given her the letter 2 months later, long enough that she was already beginning to understand that the accident story had more holes in it than a piece of tin used for target practice. Thomas had written the letter 2 weeks before he died and mailed it to the lawyer with instructions to give it to Rose in the event of his death. The kind of precaution a man takes when he thinks something bad might find him. The letter had one name in it: Caleb Trask. And the words: "He knows what happened to the Comanche Creek water rights and who paid to make the paperwork disappear. If something happens to me, find Caleb Trask and make him talk." Rose had folded that letter into thirds and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, and she had gone home and packed a bag and walked to the train station and bought a ticket south. She had not told anyone where she was going. She had not cried until she was alone in a train compartment somewhere in the middle of Kansas, and then she had cried exactly once and put it away like a folded letter, and did not take it out again for a very long time. 2 years of following Caleb Trask's name through Texas had taught her a great deal about the Wild West that no schoolteacher from Missouri had any business knowing. She learned that land in 1882 was still being taken and traded and stolen with a casualness that made her stomach turn, and that the people doing the taking were often wearing suits and carrying papers that looked perfectly legitimate and meant nothing at all. She learned that water rights were worth more than gold in a dry country. She learned that men disappeared out here, and the ground covered them up without a fuss, and that the people who made them disappear often went on to be respected citizens who attended church and donated to the county fair. She had tracked Caleb Trask through 4 counties before she landed in the town of Seco Falls and walked into the general store and asked the woman behind the counter if she knew a man by that name. The woman, who had been measuring out flour and who had the expression of someone who has seen every kind of trouble walk through a door, had looked at Rose for a long moment and then said, "Caleb Trask has been dead since '81. It's his brother's ranch now. Dexter Trask. About 6 miles north past the Cottonwood Creek, big red fence." Rose had stood in that general store for 3 full seconds, absorbing the information, and then she had said, "Thank you," in a perfectly even voice, and walked out to where her horse was hitched and ridden north. She had not known what she was going to do when she got there. The plan had always ended at Caleb Trask's front door. She had not planned for this. Now she was sitting at Dexter Trask's kitchen table, and he was pouring coffee from a blue enamel pot and setting a cup in front of her with the careful deliberateness of a man who needs something to do with his hands. "How long ago did you leave Missouri?" he asked, not looking at her. 2 years, she said. "Near about." He sat down across from her then, and he wrapped both hands around his own cup, and he looked at her with that river water gaze that saw more than she was comfortable with. "You've been chasing a dead man for 2 years. I didn't know he was dead." "No," he said. "I don't suppose you would." There was a silence that should have been uncomfortable and was instead something else, something that Rose could not name right away. It was the silence of 2 people who have both been carrying something enormous and have just recognized the weight in each other. It was not comfortable, but it was honest, and honesty had a kind of relief to it that she had forgotten about. "Your brother," she said carefully. "Caleb, what did he do? What was his business?" Dexter set down his cup. He looked at the table. He looked at the carved inscription on the wall. Then he looked back at her with an expression that said he had been waiting for someone to ask this question for a very long time and was not entirely sure he was ready to answer it and was going to answer it anyway. "My brother was a good man," he said. "And he found out something bad was happening, and he tried to stop it, and someone made sure he couldn't. Same as your Thomas, I suspect." The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Rose felt the ripples move through her. "Tell me," she said, "all of it." Dexter Trask was 28 years old, which Rose would not learn until later, and he had been running this ranch alone for 2 years, which she could see clearly in the way the place was maintained with competence but no joy. The yard was clean. The fence was sound. The cattle she had seen on her way in were healthy, but there were no curtains on the windows. There was no rug on the floor. There was a single photograph on the wall and a carved inscription, and the rest of the space was functional and empty, in the way of a man who has decided comfort is not something he deserves yet, or not something worth the effort of assembling alone. He had grown up on this land with Caleb. Their parents had come out from Tennessee in 1861 when the boys were young, their father chasing the dream of Texas cattle land, their mother chasing their father and making the best of it. The Trask Ranch had taken 20 years to become something real, and by the time the parents died within a year of each other, in 1878 and 1879, the two brothers had built it into a modest but solid operation. Enough cattle. Enough water. Enough land to breathe on. The water was the problem. It was always the water. Comanche Creek ran through the northeast corner of the Trask land and through 3 other properties before it hit the Seco River. In dry years, which most Texas years were, whoever controlled that creek controlled the grazing land for 20 miles. And in 1880, a man named Harlan Dodd had arrived in Seco Falls with a briefcase full of legal papers and a lot of money and a very patient, very practiced smile, and had begun buying water rights. Caleb Trask had noticed something wrong with the paperwork on one of those transactions. He had a good eye for numbers, Caleb did, and a stubborn streak about things being done correctly. He had gone to a lawyer in Austin, and then to a land office, and then, apparently, he had talked to Thomas Graves, who had arrived in Texas around the same time with his own investment in a stretch of creek land that Harlan Dodd was in the process of acquiring through methods that looked legal and weren't. Caleb wrote to me from Austin, Dexter said. He had been talking for a long time now, and the coffee cups had been refilled twice, and the light through the window had shifted from afternoon yellow to the deeper amber of early evening. Said he had found something important. Said he needed another few weeks to put it all together properly before he went to anyone official with it. 3 weeks later he was dead, thrown from his horse, they said. His horse that I had raised from a colt and that had never thrown anyone in its life. Rose looked at him. And you didn't report it. I reported it, he said, and there was something dry and tired in his voice. The sheriff in Seco Falls at the time was a man named Pollard. He listened to everything I had to say and wrote it all down in a little book and told me he would look into it, and I never heard another word. Pollard is gone now. Took a job in another county the following spring. The new sheriff's a different kind of man. But by then Dodd had consolidated everything he needed and the evidence Caleb had gathered was gone. Was it gone? Rose said. Dexter looked at her steadily. What are you asking me? I am asking you if your brother was the kind of man who would gather evidence and keep only one copy of it. A pause. He was not. So there might be another copy. There might be, Dexter said slowly. Caleb had a habit of keeping duplicates of important papers. He kept them in a tin box that I have never found. I looked after he died, but a lot of things went missing in the confusion of those weeks. I was not thinking clearly. Rose reached into the inside pocket of her coat and drew out Thomas's letter, unfolded it, and laid it flat on the table between them. She watched Dexter read it. She watched his expression move through several things, none of them small. He knew what Caleb found, Dexter said quietly. Your brother. He helped Caleb find it, I think, Rose said. Thomas had a head for legal documents. It was why he went to Texas in the first place. Someone had hired him to review a land deal and he had found something wrong and started pulling on the thread. Dexter looked up at her, and someone pulled back. Yes. The word fell between them, small and absolute. They sat with it for a moment, and in that moment something changed in the room. It was not dramatic. There was no thunder outside, no sudden illumination. It was simply the quiet settling of two separate griefs recognizing each other as the same shape. Rose Graves, who had been alone in her loss for 2 years, was no longer alone in it. And Dexter Trask, who had been sitting with his brother's death in this empty house for just as long, was no longer alone in his. It was a terrifying and tremendous thing. "You should stay," he said. It came out more plainly than he perhaps intended, and she could see him note that and decide not to take it back. "I have a spare room. The town is 6 miles and it'll be dark in an hour, and I think we need to talk more about what your brother knew and what Caleb might have left behind." Rose looked around the kitchen, at the empty window frames and the carved name on the wall and the man across the table who had been living quietly in the middle of a story she had only just arrived at. "All right," she said. The spare room had a rope bed with a good mattress and a quilt in a double wedding ring pattern that Rose suspected had been made by Dexter's mother, because it was beautiful in the way of something handmade with love and time. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark after Dexter had wished her a careful and slightly awkward good night, and she listened to the Texas night, which was enormous and full of crickets and the distant sound of cattle settling, and she thought about Thomas. She thought about how he had laughed, which was a kind of wheeze that turned into a full-body affair, startling everyone in the room. She thought about the stray dogs he had brought home. She thought about the letter he had written knowing he might die, the measured, careful sentences of a man who was frightened but functional, who had put his fear into words and mailed it to a lawyer and gone on with the business of trying to do the right thing. She was going to find out what happened to him. She had come here looking for one name and found instead a whole story, a story still in progress, and the man living quietly at the center of it had eyes that made her feel, uncomfortably and inconveniently, like someone had found a window in a room she thought had no light. She did not allow herself to think about that too hard. She lay down and pulled the quilt up, and she was asleep before she had finished the thought. Dexter was up before dawn, which Rose discovered because she was also up before dawn, a habit she had developed on the road when sleeping late meant losing the cool of the morning and gaining a head ride through the worst of the heat. She came out of the spare room to find him at the stove with coffee already made and cornbread already in the cast-iron pan, and he looked at her over his shoulder with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite welcome, and was perhaps the combination of both that happens when a person has been alone long enough that another presence in the morning registers as both strange and good. "I was going to check the north fence line this morning," he said. "You can ride with me if you want. There's something I need to show you." She poured coffee and stood by the window watching the sky go from black to the deep bruised purple of early morning. "What is it?" "Something I found last month that I didn't know what to do with. When you told me who you were last night and who your brother was, I understood what it meant." He paused. "I think Caleb left something out on the North Range. I've been trying to figure out if I was reading it right." They rode out after breakfast into a morning that was cooling rapidly into the dry clarity that Texas produced in its better seasons, the kind of day where the sky was so blue it seemed to press down on the land like a physical thing. Dexter rode a big gray gelding and Rose rode the bay she had bought in Oklahoma City, a sensible horse she had named Nothing because she had been feeling contrary that day, and it had made her feel slightly better. The North Range was where the Comanche Creek ran, and standing beside it in the morning light, Rose could see why it mattered. The creek was not large, but it was steady, fed by something underground that kept it running even in dry months, and the grass on its banks was green in a landscape that was mostly amber and brown. Cattle tracks in the soft mud at the edges. Good water, worth fighting for, worth worse than fighting for. Dexter dismounted at a spot where 3 old cottonwood trees stood together in a rough triangle, their roots going deep into the creek bank. He knelt at the base of the largest one, the one with a mark on it that Rose had not noticed until she was standing right beside him. A capital C cut into the bark, not carved with a knife but burned in, the way you would mark wood with a hot iron, quick and deliberate. "I noticed it last month," he said. I had looked at these trees 100 times since Caleb died and I never saw it. But I had a long look at them after a storm last October took some of the bark off that lower branch, and the light was different and I saw it. "See for Caleb," Rose said. "Or see for Comanche Creek," Dexter said. "Or both." He reached into the space between the two largest roots, his arm going in past the elbow, feeling blind. His expression was concentrated. Then it changed. He drew out a flat tin box, green with age and moisture, sealed with a strip of oilcloth wrapped around it twice, and nodded. It had been protected by the roots and the depth of the hiding place, but it was clearly old. It had been there, undisturbed, for 2 years. Rose's hands were shaking when she took it from him. She was not a woman who shook easily, and she noticed this about herself and found it informative. They opened it together, sitting on the creek bank in the morning sun, their horses grazing behind them. Inside the oilcloth were papers, legal documents, hand-copied with the meticulous handwriting of a man who understood that the copies had to be exact to mean anything. Deed records for 5 separate parcels of creek land, showing original ownership, and then a sequence of transfers that looked legal on the surface and began to look very different when you read them in order. 2 letters from Harlan Dodd to a man in Austin named Whitmore, arranging payment for services rendered. A hand-drawn map of the creek and the properties around it with notations in 2 different sets of handwriting, one of which was Caleb's and one of which Rose recognized immediately. "That's Thomas," she said. Her finger traced her dead brother's handwriting on the map. The familiar slant of his capitals, the way he made his 4s closed instead of open. He was here. He helped Caleb with this. Dexter was looking at her face and not at the papers, and she was aware of this but could not look away from the documents in her hands, from the proof that 2 men had worked together in good faith trying to stop something wrong and had died for it. "It's enough," she said when she had read everything twice. "This is enough to take to someone official, a federal land office, not a county sheriff, someone with jurisdiction that Dodd cannot touch." "The nearest federal land office is in San Antonio," Dexter said. "Then we go to San Antonio." There was a pause. He was looking at her with that careful, seeing gaze, and she met it squarely, the way she had learned to meet difficult things in 2 years on the road. "We," he said. Not questioning it exactly, just noting it. "You want to go alone?" she asked. "No," he said, and it was very simple and very immediate, and they both understood it did not refer only to the journey to San Antonio. They rode back to the ranch house to make preparations. Rose sat at the kitchen table with Caleb's papers spread before her, making a list of what they had and what it proved, and in what order it needed to be presented to someone with the authority to act on it. She had been a school teacher, and she had a school teacher's instinct for organization and clarity, and she found, not for the first time, that grief did not prevent competence. Sometimes grief sharpened it. Dexter moved around the kitchen behind her, finding food for the trail, checking his rifle, doing the 100 quiet tasks of a man who is used to managing everything alone. Twice she felt him pause near her shoulder, looking at what she was writing, and twice he made a suggestion that improved what she was writing, and both times she wrote the improvement in without comment, and he went back to what he was doing, and the collaboration had an ease to it that should not have been possible between 2 strangers who had met less than 24 hours ago. But they were not. Rose was beginning to understand, really strangers. They had been living through the same story from opposite ends for 2 years. They had the same missing pieces and the same wound and the same stubborn refusal to put it down and walk away. You could know someone a long time and share less than that. She looked up from the papers and found him watching her from across the kitchen, and she did not look away, and neither did he, and something moved between them in the warm morning air of that room that was not yet named but was certainly real, the way weather is real before you can see the clouds forming. They left for San Antonio the following morning, taking Dexter's wagon rather than riding, because Rose pointed out that documents of this nature needed to arrive flat and in good condition rather than rolled in a saddlebag, and Dexter agreed with the logic even though she could see he preferred to ride. He sat on the wagon bench with the reins loose in his hands and the tin box wrapped in fresh oilcloth between them, and the Texas landscape moved past them in the way Texas landscape moved, with the unhurried enormity of a country that did not care about human schedules. They talked, because there was a long way to go, and the silence, while not uncomfortable, was also not what either of them needed right now. They talked about Caleb and Thomas. They talked about the specifics of the land scheme, which had involved falsifying the recording date on a series of deed transfers, so that Harlan Dodd's acquisitions appeared to predate the objections filed against them, which meant the objections had been dismissed as premature when they were in fact perfectly timely. "It's clever," Rose said, and she could hear the anger under her even voice. The kind of thing a person could only do if they had someone on the inside at the county record's office. "Or if they were paying the county recorder," Dexter said, "which is what Caleb's letters suggest. The man named Whitmore in Austin is a clerk at the state land office. Dodd was paying him to alter documents. Where is Dodd now?" "Still in Seco Falls," Dexter said, and there was something very controlled in his voice. "He has a house on the main street, and he is a member of the Chamber of Commerce, and he donated money to build the new school." Rose closed her eyes briefly. "Of course he did. He's been careful since Caleb and Thomas died. He got what he wanted, and he went quiet, and he let 2 years pass." Dexter's hands tightened briefly on the reins and then deliberately relaxed. "He probably thought it was finished." "It isn't finished," Rose said. "Oh," Dexter agreed, and he looked at her sideways with something in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was the country a smile came from. "It isn't." They camped that first night by a dry creek bed where a stand of mesquite offered some windbreak, and Dexter built a small fire with the quick efficiency of a man who had done it 10,000 times, and Rose made coffee, because she had brought her own good coffee from the ranch supplies, and she had very strong feelings about coffee being made correctly. He watched her do it with an expression of mild amusement that he was not trying to hide. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You look like a woman who has an opinion about how things should be done." "I do have opinions about how things should be done. I can tell." He accepted the cup she handed him and drank from it, and his expression changed. "That's the best camp coffee I have ever had." "I know," she said. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. A real laugh, unexpected and genuine, and it transformed his face entirely, carved away the quiet weight of it, and showed her something underneath that was younger and lighter and absolutely worth seeing. She looked at the fire instead of at his face, because looking at his face in that moment felt like something she needed to be careful about. "Your brother," she said, after the laughter had settled and the night had gathered around them with its infinite Texas stars. "What was he like?" Dexter was quiet for a moment. "Stubborn. Funny in a dry way, the kind of funny where you weren't sure if he was joking until 3 seconds later. Good with animals, better than me. He could talk a spooked horse down in about 5 minutes." He looked at the fire. "He was the one who had the idea for the ranch when our father started talking about selling. Caleb said we'd built it and we should keep it, that we'd regret selling it more than we'd regret the work of keeping it. He was right." A pause. He was usually right, which was annoying. Rose smiled despite herself. "Thomas was like that too, infuriatingly sensible about things that I wanted to be unreasonable about." "Did you fight?" "Constantly," she said. "He thought I was reckless and I thought he was too cautious, and we were both right." She looked at the stars. "I used to think I had time to tell him that we had time to figure out how to be the kind of siblings who said the things directly instead of sideways." She stopped. "We didn't have time." "No," Dexter said. "We don't get warned." He said it simply, without comfort, and it was the right thing to say, because comfort would have required pretending it was not true, and they were both past the stage where pretending felt like anything but an insult. They sat by the fire until it burned low, and the conversation moved through other things, lighter things, the texture of daily life on the ranch, the peculiarities of the town of Seco Falls. a disagreement they discovered they had about the correct way to break a horse that became surprisingly heated and ended with both of them laughing again. When they finally settled for sleep, Rose in her bedroll on one side of the fire and Dexter on the other, the distance between them felt both correct and somehow insufficient, a strange combination that she recognized as dangerous and felt anyway. San Antonio was 4 days of travel, and those 4 days accumulated between them like layers of something being built. Not romance in the parlor sense, not the delicate and constrained flirtation of drawing rooms and calling cards. Something more immediate and more real than that, the romance of two people in motion together through difficult country, sharing the work of the journey and the weight of the goal, and the gradual, unstoppable process of knowing another person well enough to see them clearly. She saw him lift a wheel out of a rut on the second day with his bare hands, the muscles in his forearms working, his face set with calm effort, no complaint and no performance, just the problem and the solving of it. She saw him stop the wagon on the third day when they passed a small homestead where a woman was struggling alone with a collapsed fence section, and climb down without a word and spend an hour helping fix it, refusing the woman's offer of payment with a gentleness that had nothing of condescension in it. She saw him read in the evenings from a battered copy of Marcus Aurelius that he carried in his coat pocket, and when she raised her eyebrows at this, he said without embarrassment that a man needed something to think about that wasn't his own life. He saw her, she knew, with equal clarity. She caught him watching when she was writing her notes on the documents, and she caught him watching when she bargained for supplies at a way station on the third day, and got a price she was satisfied with. And she caught him watching most often in the evenings, when the firelight was on her face, and she was thinking about something she was not saying, the way she had learned to keep her interior life private because 2 years of being a woman alone in places that were not safe for women alone had required it. "You can say it," she told him on the third night when she caught him watching again. "Say what? Whatever you're thinking when you look at me like that." He considered the fire for a long moment. "I'm thinking," he said at last carefully, "that you are the most capable person I have met in a long time, and I'm thinking that it is a shame it took 2 years of grief to put you on the road to that cottonwood tree because I would have liked to have met you before either of us was carrying this much." Rose was quiet. The fire crackled. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote made its lonesome sound. "I don't know who I'd have been before this," she said truthfully. "I was a school teacher in Missouri. I had very definite ideas about what my life was going to look like." "What did it look like?" "Small," she said, and she meant it without self-pity. "Good but small. The school and the house and Thomas bringing home strays and me pretending to be annoyed about it." She looked at the stars. "I don't think I'd have ridden to Texas to look for anything before. I don't think I knew I could." "You know now," he said. "I know now," she agreed. They reached San Antonio on the fourth day in the early afternoon, the city spreading out before them with its mix of Spanish mission architecture and newer wooden storefronts, and the constant movement of a place that was still making itself, growing fast and messy and full of purpose. Rose had been here once before, briefly, early in her search, but she had not stopped long. Now she looked at it with different eyes, the eyes of someone who was almost at the end of something and beginning, faintly and carefully, to wonder what came next. The Federal Land Office was a brick building on Commerce Street, an assertive building that was trying to communicate permanence and authority in a landscape that was mostly still working on those qualities. They tied the wagon and went in together, and Rose carried the tin box and her organized notes, and Dexter walked beside her with the particular quiet confidence of a man who is not performing it, and therefore actually has it. The agent on duty was a man named Reeves, who had the look of a person who had seen a great many people come through his door with a great many problems, and had developed a professional wariness as a result. He looked at Rose with the polite skepticism that men in official positions frequently directed at women who came to them with legal matters, and Rose set her papers on his desk with a precision that said clearly that his skepticism was going to have a very difficult afternoon. She presented the case in the order she had arranged it, clearly and completely. Reeves read the documents. He read them again. He called in his supervisor, a man named Garrett who had a federal marshal's background and an expression that shifted from polite attention to something considerably sharper as he went through Caleb's copies of the altered deed transfers and the letters implicating Dodd and Whitmore. It took 3 hours. At the end of those 3 hours, Garrett told them that what they had brought in constituted strong evidence of federal land fraud and bribery of a state official, and that he would be contacting the marshal's office in Austin and initiating a formal investigation, and that both Rose and Dexter would be required to provide sworn statements. They gave their statements. They signed where asked. On their way out of the building into the late afternoon gold of a San Antonio street, Rose stopped on the front step and stood very still for a moment, and Dexter stopped beside her. "Is it enough?" she asked. Her voice was level, but her hands were not entirely steady. "It's enough," he said. "Garrett's a straight man. He'll see this through. What about Dodd? He'll run if he gets wind of it, but Garrett knows that too." Dexter looked at her. "We did what we could do. The rest is in their hands." Rose looked at the street, at the people moving through it carrying their ordinary lives, a woman with a basket, 2 men in conversation outside a saddle shop, a child chasing a dog, all of them living in a world where the ground under their feet was either honest or it wasn't, and mostly they would never know the difference. "It feels strange," she said, "not having a name to chase anymore." "What does it feel like?" She turned and looked at him, standing there in the afternoon light with his hands in his coat pockets and his brown eyes on her face. This man she had known for less than a week and known, in the ways that mattered, for longer than that. "It feels like standing at the edge of something," she said, "looking out and not knowing what's there." "That can be good," he said quietly, "standing at the edge and not knowing. Can it?" "It means you haven't decided yet," he said. "It means things are still possible." She looked at him for a long moment. He did not look away. He had never once, she realized, looked away from her when she looked at him. He met her directly and without armor, this man who had been living alone in a house stripped of comfort, carrying a grief like a stone in his chest, tending a ranch with the faithful determination of someone honoring a debt to the dead. "Dexter," she said, "why didn't you leave? After Caleb died, the ranch was yours to sell. You could have gone anywhere." He was quiet. "Because Caleb built it," he said at last. "Because it was his and mine, and I wasn't ready to be the only one of us left in the world. If I stayed on the land, it was like he was still there a little." "But he wasn't there," she said gently. "No," he said, "he wasn't. It's lonelier to be in a place where someone used to be than to be nowhere particular. I know that now. I didn't know how to leave." The words sat between them with a weight that was not heavy so much as full. "Come to dinner with me," Rose said. "There's a hotel restaurant on the corner. I passed it on the way in and it smelled extraordinary." He blinked, surprised by the simplicity of it, and then he almost smiled, that not quite smile that she had been cataloging over 4 days of travel. "All right," he said. The restaurant was warm and lit with oil lamps and smelled of good beef and fresh bread and beeswax candles, and they ate at a corner table and talked about things that had nothing to do with dead brothers or forged documents or long roads. He told her about the cattle breed he was trying to establish on the Trask Ranch, a cross between Longhorns and Durham cattle that he thought would be more productive in the Texas climate. She told him about the school in Millhaven and the student she had once had who could multiply 4-digit numbers in her head faster than Rose could write them on the board. He told her a story about Caleb and a particularly stubborn mule that ended with both of them laughing loudly enough that the couple at the next table turned to look, and neither of them cared. It was the best evening Rose had spent in 2 years. She recognized this clearly and without sentimentality, the way she recognized clear water or good coffee or anything that was straightforwardly what it was without apology. When they walked back to the hotel where they had taken separate rooms, they walked slowly in the cool evening air, not ready to end it. Outside the hotel door he stopped and she stopped beside him. "I don't know what you're planning," he said. "After this, where you're going." "I haven't decided," she said. "You could come back to Seco Falls," he said, and his voice was carefully even, not asking for anything, just naming the possibility the way you'd name a fork in the road. "There's a school there that has been looking for a teacher for over a year, and there's a ranch that has too many empty rooms and not enough conversation." Rose looked at him in the lamplight falling from the hotel window, at his face, which was not a handsome face in the arranged way, but was a real face, a lived-in face, the kind of face that got better the longer you looked at it because there was more to find. "You're asking me to come back with you," she said. "I'm saying you could," he said carefully. "I'm saying I would like it if you did. I am not good at—" He paused, searching. "I am not practiced at this. I have been alone for a long time and I have forgotten how to say things directly without it sounding like I'm making a demand." "It doesn't sound like a demand," she said. "It sounds like an invitation." "It is," he said. "An invitation. From someone who would very much like the chance to have more evenings like this one and more mornings with good coffee and more." He stopped again. "More of whatever this is. Because whatever it is, I haven't felt it before and I don't want to pretend I don't notice it." Rose was quiet for a moment, listening to the town around them, the distant sound of a piano from somewhere down the street, the clip of horse hooves on the road, the ordinary music of a Texas night. "I notice it too," she said. He looked at her and in his eyes she saw the same thing she had seen since the first morning, that recognition, that particular quality of attention that meant she was being seen rather than observed, understood rather than assessed. "Then come back," he said. "Ask me again in the morning," she said. "When it's daylight and the coffee's good. I make better decisions then." He laughed. "Fair enough." They went inside, to their separate rooms, and Rose lay on the hotel bed in the dark listening to her own heartbeat, which was doing something it had not done in a very long time. It was doing the thing hearts do when something real and risky and entirely worth it is on the horizon. It was doing the thing she had not expected to feel again when she folded Thomas's letter and stepped onto a train in Missouri with a bag and a name and no plan beyond finding the truth. She had found more than the truth. In the morning, over breakfast in the hotel dining room, with coffee that was perfectly acceptable and eggs that were excellent, Dexter looked at her across the table and said simply, "Well." And Rose said just as simply, "Yes." They drove back to Seco Falls in 5 days instead of 4, taking a different route through hill country that Dexter knew, and that was, he said, worth seeing. He was right. The landscape opened up into something that caught in the throat, rolling cedar hills and clear spring-fed creeks, an air that smelled of juniper and limestone. And Rose understood for the first time why people left everything behind to come west. Not only for opportunity or land or reinvention, but for the sheer unreasonable beauty of it. She spent the first of those return days still caught in the forward part of things, the momentum of the investigation and the arrival and the dinner and the decision. And by the second day she had settled into the present tense, the actual texture of the journey, which was the wagon and the hills and Dexter beside her on the bench with the reins loose, and his hat pulled down against the afternoon sun. On the third day she said, "Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with any of this." He thought about it. "I wanted to be a doctor when I was 12. There was a doctor in the town near where I grew up in Tennessee who seemed to me to be the most important person in the world. He could fix things. He had the knowledge to make broken things work again." A pause. "Then my father started having trouble with the ranch and I was needed there and I never went back to the idea, but I still read everything I can find about medicine. I have 4 medical books on my shelf." She looked at him. "And what do you do with what you know?" "I doctor the cattle mostly," he said, deadpan. "And the ranch hands when they'll let me, which is rarely, because men out here would rather limp than admit they need help." She laughed. "Could go to school," she said. "Medical school, there are programs. At 28 with a ranch to run." "I didn't say it was easy," she said. "I said you could." He looked at the road. Caleb used to say the same kind of thing, that I put limits on myself that weren't actually there. Caleb sounds like he was smart. He was, Dexter said. He was the smarter one. I was just the more stubborn one. I doubt very much that's the whole story, Rose said. He looked at her with that near smile. No, he said, maybe not the whole story. On the fourth night, camped in the hills with a good fire going and the stars overhead again, dense and brilliant and overwhelming, the way they always were out here where there was no town light to dull them, Dexter said without preamble, I'm going to say something. And I want you to let me say all of it before you respond, because I'm going to lose my nerve in the middle and I need to get through it. Rose set down her coffee cup. All right. He was looking at the fire. I have spent 2 years telling myself that the emptiness in that house was because Caleb was gone. And that was true. It was always true. Caleb was my brother and I miss him every day. But there was another kind of emptiness that I had decided was just how things were going to be for me. That I was a man who had built his life around something that was already over, and the right thing to do was to tend it properly and not want more than that. He paused. And then you walked into my kitchen with your boots covered in dust and your hand on a photograph you had knocked off the wall, and you were so clearly ready to do battle with whatever you found there, and I thought, there is someone who is still alive. And it woke something up in me that I had been fairly successful at keeping quiet. He stopped. Rose waited. I want you to know, he said, that what I feel for you is not gratitude for finding Caleb's evidence, and it is not loneliness looking for a target. It is something that started in that first conversation at the kitchen table and has been growing every day since, and it is specific to you, to who you are, to the way you think and the way you fight for things and the way you make camp coffee that is genuinely too good. He finally looked up at her. I don't know what you came looking for when you rode out here, but I want you to know what you found. The fire crackled. The hills were dark around them. Rose looked at this man who had said a hard thing with full courage, without deflecting or softening it into something safer, and she felt everything she had been being careful about come loose at once, the way a carefully maintained fence gives way all at once when the post that was holding it finally lets go. What I found, she said, was not what I expected. What I found was a man who has been living inside someone else's story, maintaining it faithfully, and who is overdue for his own. She looked at him steadily. I want to be in your story, Dexter, not to solve anything or to complete anything. Because you are the most real person I have encountered in a very long time, and real is what I need. He looked at her for a long moment with everything in his face. No control, no careful management, just the real thing. And it was enough to make the whole wide Texas night feel suddenly very small and very close and very warm. He reached across and took her hand where it rested on her knee, his large, warm hand covering hers, and she turned her palm up and held on. They sat like that for a long time, hands joined, watching the fire burn down, and the hills were dark and the stars were brilliant, and there was no pretending anymore that this was anything less than what it was. They arrived back in Seco Falls on a Wednesday afternoon in early autumn, the air beginning to carry the first suggestion of a change in temperature, and the town went about its business without paying them particular notice, which suited Rose perfectly. She was not a person who wanted notice. She wanted to work and to be useful and to stay. The school situation proved even more straightforward than Dexter had suggested. The school board in Seco Falls had indeed been without a teacher for over a year, the previous one having left to marry a man in Dallas, and they were so relieved to find a qualified replacement that they asked very few questions about how she had come to be in Seco Falls, and simply wanted to confirm that she held a teaching certificate, which she did from the Missouri State Normal School, 1876. She started the following Monday. The boarding house in town was run by a woman named Mrs. Elena Vasquez, who was 60 years old and had been in the Seco Falls area for 40 of them, and knew everything about everyone with the cheerful precision of a woman who had made herself the unofficial archivist of the entire community. She gave Rose a room, and within 3 days knew everything about why she had come to Texas, and had opinions about Harlan Dodd that were vivid and specific and entirely unprintable. "That man has been a rot in this town since he arrived," Mrs. Vasquez said over breakfast on Rose's second morning in the boarding house, pouring coffee with the authority of a woman who had earned the right to say whatever she pleased. "He bought the land and he bought the people and he smiled through all of it. I hope they take everything from him." "They may," Rose said. She had received a letter from Agent Garrett in San Antonio the previous week confirming that the investigation was proceeding and that Harlan Dodd had been formally notified that he was under investigation, which meant he could not leave the county without federal notice. "The evidence is strong. I remember Caleb Trask," Mrs. Vasquez said, sitting down with her own cup. "Good man, his brother too, though Dexter keeps to himself too much. That boy has been too long alone." Rose looked at her coffee. "Nothing wrong with a man who runs a ranch coming into town more often," Mrs. Vasquez said with complete innocence. "Nothing wrong with that at all. Dexter came into town on Fridays, which had apparently been his pattern for years, to collect supplies and check the mail and do whatever business needed to be done in person. The first Friday after Rose's return, he found her at the general store, and they stood in the aisle between the flour and the tinned goods and talked for 20 minutes about the documents in the case, and about her first week of school, and about a calf that had been born on the ranch the previous Tuesday that was doing well. And every word of the conversation was entirely ordinary, and every word of it was charged with the accumulated weight of everything that had happened and everything that had been said by a fire in the hill country. And Mrs. Vasquez, who happened to be in the store and happened to walk past that aisle twice, went home and told her daughter that the new schoolteacher and the Trask boy were not going to be alone much longer, and you could put money on it. Dexter began coming into town on Wednesdays too, then Tuesdays. Rose did not remark on the increasing frequency, but she noticed it, and the noticing had a warmth to it that she allowed herself to feel without qualification. He brought her things, not gifts in the formal sense, but the casual, practical generosity of a man who had spent his life noticing what was needed and providing it without ceremony. He brought her a better lamp for her room at the boarding house, because the existing one was insufficient for the quantity of reading she did in the evenings. He brought her a bridal fitting for nothing that he had noticed was worn, spending an afternoon repairing it without being asked. He brought her, once, a book he had found in San Antonio before they left, a collection of Mary Wollstonecraft's writing that he had purchased with the air of a man who had given the matter some thought and was confident in the choice. She had stared at that book for a long moment, holding it in both hands, and then looked up at him where he stood in the doorway of the school after the children had gone for the day and said, "You know what this is." "I know what it is," he said, "and you brought it to me." "It seemed like something you'd want to read," he said, "and argue with, or agree with, or both." She had both argued with it and agreed with it, and reported all of this to him in detail the following Friday, and he had listened with complete attention, and then offered a perspective that surprised her with its depth and nuance, and they had stood outside the general store in the late afternoon sun arguing companionably about Mary Wollstonecraft in 1882 Texas. And several people who passed them gave them curious looks, and Rose was radiantly unconcerned. She began riding out to the ranch on Sundays, not because it was expected or arranged, but because she wanted to, and because the wanting to was something she had decided to honor rather than manage. She helped where she could, which at first was in ways she knew from general competence, and then in ways she was learning, because Dexter was a patient teacher, and because she had always been the kind of person who preferred understanding things to relying on others to understand them for her. She learned the basic management of cattle from a distance, the reading of pasture and water, and the signs of an animal that needed attention. She learned the names of the ranch hands, the two men who worked for Dexter, an older man named Pete who had been there since Caleb's time, and a younger one named Lewis who was Pete's nephew, and who had a gift with horses that Dexter said was near to miraculous. She learned the rhythms of the place, the way it breathed with the seasons and the work, and she found, to her genuine surprise, that she loved it with an immediacy that she had not anticipated, and that felt very much like recognition. The investigation moved forward through October and November. 2 federal marshals arrived in Seco Falls in early October and spent a week interviewing people and examining records. And Harlan Dodd's face, when Rose saw him on the main street during that week, had lost all its practiced ease and showed something underneath that was frightened and calculating and absolutely guilty. He tried to speak to her once, catching her outside the school, and she looked at him with the full measure of 2 years of grief and fury compressed into perfect composure, and said, "You should speak to the federal marshal's office, Mr. Dodd, not to me," and walked back inside without breaking stride. He was indicted in November. The man Whitmore in Austin was arrested the same week. The hearing was set for the following spring in Austin, and both Rose and Dexter were called as witnesses, which meant a return trip to the state capitol and several days of testimony in front of a federal judge. Rose wrote her testimony with the same careful organization she had used for the initial presentation to Garrett, and Dexter reviewed it and added what he knew. And they worked on it together at the kitchen table of the ranch house on a Sunday in late November, while rain came down outside and Pete and Lewis were in the bunkhouse. And the house was warm with the smell of the beef stew Rose had put on the stove because it was a good day for stew, and because making herself at home in this kitchen had happened so gradually that by the time she noticed it, it was already done. It was that Sunday in the early evening when the stew was ready and the rain was steady and the papers were organized and they were sitting across from each other with the lamplight between them, that Dexter put down his pen and looked at her with the absolute directness she had come to understand was simply how he was, underneath any reserve, underneath the long habit of solitude. He was a man who looked at things straight. "I would like to ask you something," he said. Rose put down her own pen. "Ask." "I am not a man with very much to offer," he said, in the way that that phrase is usually meant. "I have this ranch and I have the work and I have a house that is, I will admit, in need of some improvement in the area of curtains." "It is severely lacking in curtains," she agreed. "I have bad habits of silence and I am apparently too much in my own head and I am told I am difficult to know, though I think that has been less true lately." He met her eyes. "But I am a man who intends to do exactly what he says he will do, and who would not waste a day of whatever time we have being anything less than completely honest with you, and who is," he paused, "deeply, entirely in love with you. Which is something I have not said to anyone before and which I am saying now because I think you should know it and because I think you have suspected it for a while." Rose felt the words settle into her with the completeness of something true. "Dexter," she said. "I am asking you," he said, "if you will marry me, if you will make a life here with me, whatever that life turns out to be. I know you had a life in Missouri and I know you gave it up and I know you are not a woman who needs someone else's life. You are perfectly capable of building your own, which is one of the things I love most about you. But I am asking if you would consider building it here, with me." Outside the rain was steady, and the lamplight was warm, and the stew smelled of the kind of comfort that is only possible when you are exactly where you should be. "I have been building it here," Rose said quietly. "I have been building it here for 3 months. I have been in love with you for approximately the length of a ride through hill country, and I have been trying to be sensible about it, which I am now prepared to stop doing." He looked at her, and the weight that she had seen in his face since the first morning, the weight of 2 years of lonely, faithful, grieving solitude, shifted and lifted, and underneath it was the face of a man who was, without reservation, happy. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That is emphatically a yes," she said. He was around the table before she had finished the sentence, and when he pulled her up and held her, it was the way people hold things they have been afraid of losing, which is to say, carefully and completely, and with no intention of letting go. She pressed her face into the warm, solid reality of his shoulder, and felt him breathe and thought about Thomas, who would have had a great deal to say about this, and most of it would have been teasing and all of it would have been happy for her. And she let herself feel that clearly, and then she let it be, the way she was learning to let grief be, present and real and not the whole story. They were married in January, a clear cold morning in the Seco Falls Church, a small adobe building with whitewashed walls and a wooden cross above the door, with Mrs. Vasquez in the front pew making no effort whatsoever to conceal her satisfaction, and Pete and Louis scrubbed and uncomfortable in their best shirts, and the children from Rose's school crowded in the back rows with the bright-eyed interest of people who understood instinctively that something important was happening. Rose wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool, a practical color for a practical woman, and she carried a bunch of dried wildflowers that Dexter had found preserved from the summer before and tied with a piece of the blue ribbon she used to mark pages in her books. He wore his best clothes, which were significantly improved from their first meeting, and he stood at the front of that little church and watched her walk down the aisle with the expression of a man who cannot believe his luck and is aware that luck is not quite the right word, but has not yet found the right one. The word was grace. It would come to him later. After the ceremony, Mrs. Vasquez organized a celebration at the boarding house that involved enough food for 3 times the number of people present and music provided by a man named Cordero, who played the fiddle with a passionate intensity that got everyone moving, even Pete, who was claiming to have an injured ankle that was clearly not injured in the least. Rose danced with Dexter and with Louis and with 3 of her students and with Mrs. Vasquez, who danced with surprising energy for a woman of 60. And at some point in the middle of all of it, she looked across the room and found Dexter watching her from where he was talking with Pete. And the expression on his face was the one she had been cataloging since the beginning, the near smile, the direct gaze, but expanded now, opened, the full version, and it was the best thing she had ever seen. They went home to the ranch that evening, and the house was warm and lit, and there were, finally, curtains on the windows, because Rose had made them in December from a length of yellow calico she had found at the general store, and Dexter had hung them with care on a Saturday morning while she told him stories about her students, and he occasionally made comments from the stepladder that were so dry and so precisely funny that she had to stop talking to recover. The house was home. It had become home so gradually and so completely that pinpointing when it happened was impossible, which is the nature of homes, the real ones. They do not announce themselves. They simply become inevitable. Spring in Texas was extraordinary, a brief and brilliant season that came in like a tide and left almost before you could hold it. The wildflowers happened in March, the bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush spreading across the hill country in waves of color that stopped Rose cold the first morning. She rode out to the north pasture and found the creek bank gone to blue. She sat on nothing for a long time just looking at it, and when Dexter came up beside her on the gray gelding, she did not say anything, and neither did he, because some things are too large for commentary. The trial in Austin happened in April. It was 4 days, and Rose gave her testimony clearly and in full, and looked Harlan Dodd in the face while she did it. He had shrunk somehow between his indictment and the trial. The practiced ease and the careful smile were gone, and what was left was a smaller man, a frightened man, a man who had made the calculation that other people's losses were acceptable costs, and was now being required to account for that calculation in public, in front of a federal judge, with a stack of his own letters as evidence. He was convicted on 8 counts of land fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy. Whitmore was convicted alongside him. The sentences were delivered and they were significant, and when Rose walked out of the federal courthouse in Austin into the bright spring afternoon, she stood on the steps for a moment and breathed in the warm air and felt something that had been braced inside her for 2 years release all at once, quietly, like a breath you have been holding so long you forgot you were holding it. Dexter was beside her. He was always beside her now, and she was always beside him, and this was not the loss of independence that she had once feared it might be, but was instead its own kind of freedom, the freedom of having someone who would stand beside you in the things that mattered and move with you through the world and let you be entirely who you were without asking you to be smaller. Thomas would be satisfied, she said. Yes, Dexter agreed. And Caleb. She reached for his hand and he took it, and they walked down the courthouse steps together into a life that was still being made but was, she knew completely, exactly the one it was supposed to be. The ranch changed that year, not dramatically, but in the ways that a place changes when it is properly inhabited again. Rose had opinions about the garden, which had been untended since the parents' time, and she put those opinions into practice through the spring and summer, planting vegetables and a row of roses along the south side of the house, because her name was Rose and she had always intended to grow them, and this was the place where intending could become doing. Dexter helped with the heavy work of turning the soil, and Lewis helped with the irrigation, and Pete shook his head at the whole enterprise with the affectionate skepticism of a man who had learned not to argue with things that were clearly going to happen regardless. The roses were extraordinary, blooming in June in deep red and yellow, and one pink variety that climbed the fence post near the kitchen window. And every morning Rose woke to the smell of them, and felt the simple, profound rightness of a thing put in the ground taking root. She was, by that June, carrying their first child, which she had told Dexter on a morning in April with the matter-of-fact directness she brought to everything important, watching his face go through the sequence of things that faces go through when they receive the best possible news. He had sat down at the kitchen table without meaning to, as if his legs had simply decided they needed a moment, and then he had looked up at her with wet eyes that he did not try to conceal and said, in a voice that was not entirely steady, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "Better than well." He stood up and held her with the particular careful intensity of that evening in January, and she felt him breathe against her hair, and she thought that of all the things she had not been looking for when she rode into this ranch with her boots full of Oklahoma dust and 2 years of grief and a name in her pocket, this was the thing she had not known she was missing, and had found. The summer was warm and slow, and full of the work of the ranch and the school, which Rose continued to teach, rearranging her days as necessary with the practical creativity of a woman who refused to accept that a growing baby was a reason to stop doing her work, and with the full support of Dexter, who rearranged his own schedule more than once to ensure she had what she needed, and who never once, not once, suggested she should do less because of her condition. Because he understood her well enough to know that suggesting less was the most counterproductive thing he could possibly do. The baby came in November, in the bedroom of the ranch house, attended by the doctor from Seco Falls, a steady-handed man named Avery who had been delivering babies in the area for 15 years, and who told Rose afterward that she was the most organized patient he had ever attended, which she took as the compliment he intended. Their son was born healthy and loud and thoroughly indignant about the whole affair, with Dexter's dark hair and Rose's gray eyes, and when they placed him in Dexter's arms, the man who had been living quietly alone in an empty house looked down at this small, furious person and said nothing at all for a long time, and the silence was so full it needed no supplementing. They named him Thomas Caleb Trask, because some names needed to be carried forward, and because the men they honored deserved to have their names spoken in happiness rather than only in grief. Thomas Caleb was 6 months old in the spring when the first letter arrived from a law office in Austin, informing them that, as the next of kin of Caleb Trask, a rightful claimant in the land fraud case, Dexter was entitled to restitution in the amount of the assessed value of the water rights that had been illegally transferred. The amount was substantial, not transformatively so, but substantial enough to make a difference to a ranch operating on careful margins. They used it to hire 2 additional hands, which allowed Dexter to spend less time in the fields and more time doing the work he was genuinely good at: the management and the breeding program, and the careful reading of cattle that was part instinct and part the medical knowledge he had accumulated over years of private study. The Durham cross breed he had been working on was beginning to show results, the calves healthy and well-formed, and a buyer in San Antonio made inquiries in the summer of that second year that led to a contract that secured the ranch's future on considerably better terms than it had enjoyed in some time. Rose received a separate restitution payment as the heir of Thomas Graves, which she deposited with the bank in Seco Falls and considered for some time. She used part of it to endow a small book collection for the school, which had been working with a scarcity of reading material that she had been quietly supplementing from her own pocket for a year and a half. The rest she kept for Thomas Caleb's future, because a boy with his father's eyes and his grandfather's name deserved to have options. Mrs. Vasquez came to dinner at the ranch on Sunday evenings with the regularity of a woman who has decided she is family and is not wrong. She brought things, food and gossip, and the particular energy of someone who has lived a long time and has opinions about everything and is not shy about them. And she adored Thomas Caleb with the fierce, practical love of a woman who had outlived her own children and transferred that love outward into the community around her. Pete, who turned out to have a previously unsuspected softness where babies were concerned, could be found with Thomas Caleb at any opportunity, walking him around the yard or showing him the horses with the solemn gravity of a man introducing someone important to the great affairs of the world. Lewis made the baby a small carved horse out of mesquite wood, sanded smooth and painted in careful strokes, that sat on the shelf in the bedroom next to the quilt from Dexter's mother. The carving from the kitchen wall in memory of Caleb Trask remained. Rose would not have removed it for anything in the world. She had added to the wall beside it, in her own handwriting copied onto a piece of paper that Dexter had then carefully pressed to the wood and traced with ink, a line that read, "And Thomas Graves, who followed the truth." Both names were there. Both men present in the house in the way that the dead are present when the living honor them, not as ghosts but as weight, as foundation, as the reason the floor you stand on holds. In the 3rd year of their marriage, on a warm September evening with Thomas Caleb 2 years old and terrorizing the yard under the supervision of a very patient Pete, Rose sat on the porch of the ranch house watching the sun go down over the Texas hills and feeling the second child moving in her, quiet and deliberate, not yet ready to announce anything, and Dexter came and sat beside her and followed her gaze out over the land. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She considered. "About how things end up," she said. "How if you had told me when I got on that train in Missouri that I was going to end up here, on this porch with this man, I would have..." She paused. "I would not have believed it. I had a very specific idea of what I was doing and where I was going, and none of it looked like this." "Better or worse than what you expected," he said, but she could hear in his voice that he was not afraid of the answer. "Incomparably better," she said. "Incomparably. There is no version of that plan I made in Missouri that ends like this." He reached over and took her hand, the same way he had taken it at the creek bank, the same way he had taken it in the hill country by the fire, with the same unhurried certainty that said, "This is where my hand goes, this is where it belongs." "I have been thinking," he said. "That sounds ominous," she said. "Not ominous," he said. "I have been thinking about the medical books, about what it would take to apprentice with Dr. Avery. He mentioned it last spring, that he had no one to take over the practice when his knees give out, which from the sound of it will be soon." Rose turned to look at him, and his expression was the expression she loved most, the one that had taken her weeks to understand, the one that was tentative and steady at once, a man who has an idea that matters to him and has decided to say it anyway. "You want to learn medicine properly," she said. "Avery said I could ride with him twice a week. That it would take a few years, but that I have enough of the background already that it would not be starting from nothing. He looked at her carefully. It would mean adjusting some things here. I would need to hire someone to manage what I can't be present for. Then hire someone, Rose said. It would mean spending time away from the ranch. Yes, she said, it would. You would not object to it, he said, and it was not a question, it was him recognizing who she was. I would celebrate it, she said. Dexter, you have been tending this ranch and tending your brother's memory and tending everything around you for 3 years, and I love you for every part of it. But you are allowed to tend yourself as well. You are allowed to go after the thing you wanted when you were 12 and never stopped wanting. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the hills, and she could see the thing she had been watching happen for 3 years, the gradual unclosing of a man who had decided, at some point in a very hard season of his life, that he was not allowed to want too much, unclose a little further. Then I'll speak to Avery, he said. You will, she agreed. The second child came the following April, another boy. A quieter personality than Thomas Caleb, but no less present. With Dexter's steadiness already visible in the way he regarded the world with a kind of patient attention from his first days. They named him James Henry Trask, James for Rose's father and Henry for Dexter's, and the ranch house, which had once been empty and was now full, grew a little fuller. Dexter apprenticed with Dr. Avery through the 4th and 5th years of their marriage, riding out twice a week to attend patients and learn procedures, and accumulate the knowledge that he had been building theoretically for years into something practical and applicable. He was, Avery told Rose privately, one of the best students he had encountered in 30 years of practice, because he came with the foundation already laid and the instinct already developed, and the patience to do things correctly rather than quickly. The ranch ran well under the management of a man named Cord who Dexter hired on Pete's recommendation. A capable and quiet man who Pete vouched for with the decisive economy of someone who does not waste endorsements. Pete himself was getting older, moving more slowly, taking longer over the morning chores, but refusing absolutely to reduce his work or accept any modification to his role. And Rose and Dexter let him be what he was with the respect you owe someone who has given their working life to a place you love. Rose taught school through all of it, through both pregnancies and both infancies, adjusting and adapting and continuing, because the children of Seco Falls needed a teacher, and because teaching was the work she had come from and the work she was good at, and she was not interested in stopping. The school grew in those years, the collection of students expanding as more families came to the area, and the board approved the construction of a second room which Rose furnished with the care she brought to everything she built. On the morning of their 5th anniversary, Dexter came into the kitchen while Rose was feeding James Henry, who was 8 months old and deeply invested in the business of oatmeal, and set something on the table in front of her. It was a tin box, not Caleb's tin box, which was in the possession of the federal court records, but a new one, similar in size, with her initials pressed into the lid. "Open it," he said, and his voice had the quality of someone who has planned something and is, despite himself, nervous about the reaction. Inside the box was a folded paper. She opened it with one hand, the other still managing James Henry's spoon. It was a land deed. For 12 additional acres bordering the north pasture, purchased in her name, signed over in her name, not in his. A piece of the creek land that had been at the heart of everything, that had cost 2 men their lives and sent her on a 2-year search through 4 states, now deeded to Rose Graves Trask in her own right. She looked at the deed for a long time. James Henry successfully intercepted the spoon and began conducting his own operations. "It came available last month," Dexter said. "Through the restitution settlement, it felt right." Rose looked up at him. "You gave me Comanche Creek. I gave you the part of it that should have been your brother's," he said. "The part that your brother and my brother were trying to protect. I thought you should have it." She set the deed down carefully. She stood up and took his face in both hands, this man with his river water eyes and his medical books and his slow smile and his absolute and irreplaceable steadiness. And she held his face, and he put his hands over hers, and they looked at each other for a moment with the full weight of everything they had built. "I love you," she said. "I have been in love with you for 4.5 years, and it gets larger every year, and I want you to know that." "I know it," he said. "I feel it every day." He turned his face to press his lips to her palm, brief and warm. "I love you, Rose. I have loved you since you looked at a photograph on my kitchen floor and refused to cry. I will love you every day we have." James Henry, from his chair, made an imperious sound indicating that the oatmeal situation had been neglected long enough. They both looked at him, and then at each other, and the laugh that came from them both at the same moment was the kind that fills a room entirely, the kind that a house needs to have running through it, the kind that Dexter Trask had not laughed in the years before a dust-covered woman with a name in her pocket rode up his front lane and changed the whole shape of his story. Thomas Caleb was 7 when he found the photograph of his uncle's and asked about it, standing on his toes in the kitchen to see the wall clearly. Rose sat him down and told him about his Uncle Thomas, the man who laughed too loud and brought home dogs and wrote a letter that sent his mother across 4 states and into the best life she could have imagined. Dexter sat beside them and told Thomas Caleb about his Uncle Caleb, who was stubborn and funny, and had hidden a tin box in the roots of a cottonwood tree and left it for the right person to find. Thomas Caleb listened with the absolute attention of a child who understands that he is receiving something important, and at the end he said, with the satisfying directness of a 7-year-old, "So they saved each other, even after they died." Rose and Dexter were quiet for a moment. "Yes," Dexter said, "that is exactly what they did." That evening, with both boys asleep and the house quiet around them, Rose and Dexter sat on the porch in the last of the September light, the hills going purple and gold in the distance, the garden with its roses catching the last warmth, the creek somewhere out to the north running steady as it always had. The place that had been empty was full. The story that had been living quietly around one man was now, undeniably, a story for 2. She leaned against his shoulder and he wrapped an arm around her, and they watched the Texas dark come on with the unhurried patience of 2 people who have learned that good things are worth waiting for and worth staying for, and who intend to stay. The cottonwood trees by Comanche Creek were still standing. The creek still ran. The land that had cost so much was tended now by people who knew its price and its worth, who farmed it and grazed it, and let the water run the way water is meant to run, freely and clean, through country that was still being made. Rose Graves had ridden into this story looking for one name, and found instead an entire life, richer and truer and larger than anything she had mapped out on the train heading south from Missouri. She had found a man who had been tending things faithfully in the quiet, who had been waiting without knowing he was waiting, who had needed exactly what she had to bring. A pair of eyes that saw clearly, a mind that organized things toward justice, a heart that had been broken open and refused to close. And Dexter Trask, who had spent 2 years in an empty house keeping faith with the dead, had found what the living need most. He had found someone to come home to. He had found someone to build with, to argue with about Mary Wollstonecraft and the correct way to break a horse and the absolute necessity of good camp coffee, to make a life with in the full and impractical and absolutely necessary sense. He had found, in a woman who came looking for a name and found an entire story, the whole rest of his. They stayed on that porch until the stars were out, and the night was full of the sounds of the land they loved. And inside the house, 2 boys slept under quilts in rooms with yellow calico curtains, and the carved names on the kitchen wall kept watch, and the roses on the south fence breathed in the dark, rooted deep and flowering still.